viewers, IAS Academy. On an ongoing discussion with respect to the prelims 2021 and the important topics for that. So, we have recognized this off-budget borrowing could be a very innovative solution taken up by the Indian government with respect to financing its deficit and an alternative method to increase the expenses and meet the needs of the government. So, keeping that in mind, this off-borrow budgeting would be very important, and we could make an analysis on how such initiatives or the measures taken by the government in the long run would it be advantageous, beneficial for the government, or if the borrowing starts more and more, and if the government start clinging on such alternatives ways only, does it actually benefits the fiscal deficit of the government is what a bigger issue. So we will have a discussion on why does government borrow half budget, and how does the budgeting process and how does this public sector undertakings are directed by the government to take the loans and provide the money or the funds for the government to meet its need. So this being an alternative technique or a newer initiative developed or infiltrated by the government, it would be important for us. So why this was in use is because off-budget loans helps meet the expenses of the union government. We have a lot of expenses. Deficit is that when the expenses increase above your revenues, that becomes a deficit. So whenever you start eating, you have 10 rupees and you start eating more than 10 rupees, that becomes your deficit. And when you buy, you don't have money of 20 rupees, but you're eating a substance of more than your expenses, your revenues, that becomes a deficit. So you will be in a deficit position where you need some money or some funds to fulfill that gap. So that is the deficit financing which we call. So the union government took off-budget loans to help to meet its expenses but are not counted in the fiscal deficit. These are not directly taken by the central government, but they are made and directed to some government public sector undertakings to take up the loans and raise the funds for the union government. So this would become an indirect measure by the central government. So what is this? We are talking about this fiscal deficit. What does it actually mean? Do we have to worry about the fiscal deficit? See, so that is why when the expenses increase with respect to your revenues, when the revenues goes down and the expenses or the expenditure increases, there exists a deficit. So fiscal deficit basically means a gap between what the government spends and what the government earns. So that would become, that would be total expenditure, total revenue and total receipts. See, we have total revenue and total receipts, the revenue receipts which we get. This excluding the borrowings, we are talking about the excluding the borrowings. So when we exclude the borrowings and the total revenue which we get, and the gap between these two becomes the fiscal deficit. That is the total expenditures minus the non-debt capital receipt. That is the non-debt creating capital receipts. So that would become the gap between the earning and the spending in the normal terms could be taken up as fiscal deficit. So why does the government try to keep a fiscal deficit in check? Why do we have to worry about these gaps, and why do we have to check this, and what is the government thinking about it? It is that mainly we have some three criteria which would really matter for an economic condition to happen in a country. That would be financial health of the government. So high fiscal deficit depicts poor state of government finances. So financial health of the government should be in check. So that is it. High fiscal deficit, that is we are not able to have our expenses in a limited way. That would become a lower and a bad health of the economy, such that the government finances would be in a poorer state. Then lower ratings by the rating agencies. When the health of the financial condition of a country decreases, gradually the rating agencies would also rate low. The bad impression on the fiscal condition of a government would lead to a very lesser investment, lesser inflows, and lesser money multipliers also. So that is why we have to keep in check. The rating agencies may downgrade the sovereign bonds due to high fiscal deficit, and it will affect the borrowing capacity of the government. So mainly we are concerned about we would not be able to take the borrowings from the international banks also. Neither the states would be able to provide the expenses or the deficit or the debts to the government. So that would decrease the borrowing. Ratings is directly proportional to your borrowings, and it affects the impression of the government. Then what is this crowding out effect? So we have the crowding out effect also. That is, the money borrowing by the union government often creates fund scarcity for private players. So this becomes the crowding out effect. Whenever the government start liquidating the market, the private players would be happier position and the funds would be raised. But when the government start pruning up the money, there exists the fund scarcity and the private players would also be affected. That leads to the crowding out effect of the fiscal deficit. Then that is why one way to keep the fiscal deficit low is resorting to off-budget borrowing. So to keep it low and increase the financial health of the government and show that the government is not only taking the debts or loan, it is not in vain, but it would be a good approach in asking other public sector undertakings to take up the money and give it to the government to meet its expenses. That initiative is called as off-budget borrowing. So I guess we would have explained about fiscal deficit and why the fiscal deficit is important. So next we will see how actually this off-budget borrowing works. So this off-budget borrowing is a loan which is not directly taken by the union government. So we came to know in the first slides. So it is not directly taken by the, so whenever in an option if you get that off-budget borrowings are taken up by the government, then you can eliminate easily. It is not a direct initiative by the government, it is a fund raised by the public sector, that's it. But it is used to fund the expenses of the center. What is the role of center in that? This funds would increase the expenses for finance the expenses of the government, and that is called as off-budget borrowing. Then, example, the loan that by public sector undertaking was supposed to take on their behalf, and deferred payments of bills and loans by the center. So this is very simple. It's not a direct initiative by the government, but on behalf the public sector undertakings would finance the government. So do you think taking such loans would be very beneficial? Is it a wise way? So that is what we will come into the conclusion. So how are off-budget borrowing raised? And we have some examples of public sector oil marketing and FCI, how this FCI and public sector oil marketings have helped to deficit finance for the central government. So the government can ask an implementing agency to raise the required fund for the market through loans or by issuing bonds. So we have two vehicles or measures to do that. They are by bonds or by the loans. And the fundraising agencies could be any public sector agency. It could be IOCL, NGC, whichever it is able to connect to the network and prove the money from the market would be a beneficial part of the off-budget borrowing. So for that example, FCI was asked to take a loan from National Small Saving Fund to fund half of the budgeted food subsidy. So food subsidy to manage the food subsidy. This allowed the center to half its subsidy bill from 1,51,000 crores to 77,892 crores. So you can imagine the gap, how this finance has helped the government in recurring this food subsidies. And in the year 2021, the recent borrowing only by the FCI and public sector oil marketing is also a good example, where subsidized gas cylinders for Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana beneficiaries. In the past, we had this initiative, the subsidies of the gas cylinders. There, we found a deficit. So for that, the public sector of oil marketing companies were asked to raise the fund for the government, and loans from PSU banks were used to make up for the shortfall in the release of fertilizer subsidy. So you're getting it now, it is directly going to the beneficiaries such as the food subsidy deficit, the fertilizer subsidy. So whenever the spendings increases, the financing also should come up now, and the matching of the spending and expenses and the revenue generation is very directly proportional. That is why this kind of initiatives such as off-budget borrowing are taken up by the Indian government. Then, what is the criticism? So do you feel whenever we have a deficit, is it good in making loans? Or there could be a good option in planting up some infrastructure and generating the money, or increasing the employment, or increasing the ports. Don't you feel such things would be a positive way? Just taking up loans or asking somebody, it is like asking your friend to raise money and give it to you just because of your expenses. So that is why we have experienced some of the criticisms also. The criticisms is that CAG, Comptroller Auditor General, in its 2019 report condemned off-budget borrowing for keeping executive expenses out of parliamentary control. So CAG has raised up the issues of the executive expenses. As we have financed our fertilizer subsidies, food subsidies, even in the part of the executive expenses also there was a deficit, and we used this half-budget borrowings. So that is why CAG has raised this issue. And disguised fiscal deficit. What is this? The CAG pegged up the actual fiscal deficit for 2017 at 5.85 of GDP. Instead, the government version was 3.46. There is a disguise and a misconception of the numbers. The targeted numbers are different and the projected numbers are different. So this disguised fiscal deficit is also a concern raised by the CAG itself. Then the violation of FRBM Act. What is this FRBM? Fiscal responsibility. We should have some fiscal responsibility, fiscal deficit, to keep the financial health of the government, as we saw in the first slide. And the crowding out effect should also be kept in mind. So that is why off-budget borrowing increase the fiscal deficit. For sure it would increase the fiscal deficit by unknown amount and violate the principle of fiscal prudence and intergenerational equity regarding spending capacity. So whenever you get more than what you expected, really results back to spending capacity, the moral spending capacity. And we have some set of rules in FRBM Act 2013, that is, we have the fiscal rules, the fiscal prudence, and the intergenerational equity would also increase, and the government would start spending more and more when the money funded also increases. Then the severity of the crowding out effect also increases. We would have a clash with the private sector entities, and that would be a fiscal prudence for sure. So this was a criticism or a cons of having off-budget borrowing, and how we could have some off-budget borrowing in the detrimental times and avoid off-budget borrowing when we are in the positive conditions. So that depends on the situational conditions, how you are able to half-budget the system. Then, what is the conclusion? So as you heard about the positive part and the negative part of off-budget borrowings would really help with the immediate expenses and immediate needs of the government. Yes, for sure. But the subsidized, the important prudence, the fiscal deficit, is it met? And the spending capacity would increase. And if the government changes, the next government would be able to use that fiscal deficit only. So there are many questions which are not answered by using this tool as a good borrowing. So that is why the conclusion goes like, off budget borrowing must be avoided as far as possible. So this should be a last resort. Okay, you should not resort suddenly when you have an expenses. You don't ask your friends to give the money. You have to try to earn. The revenue capital expenditures should be increased such that you control your expenses to the largest. Controlling the expenses and increase the revenue faster as possible. And then it is better to report separately under the heading of extra budgetary borrowings, and so that the fiscal transparency can be maintained for accountable governance. So you would become an accountable governance if you keep it as an extra budgetary borrowings and make it at a very fast pace. Not only bonds, loans, and many other innovative initiatives could be taken into play and have a correct way in taking all this borrowing. So that is why we should not jump to the conclusion in the first part only. We have to strive hard to decrease our expenses and cut down the gap between the spendings and the expenses. So this becomes the conclusion, and this becomes a summary of having why does government borrows the off-budget borrowing, is that to meet its expenses in a very shorter time and to present the budget to the government, to the people in a faster way, and the expenses should be taken up in a faster way. So the duration of all these things is very less. So that is why the long-term promise is not kept through. That is why off-budget borrowings are done. Once in a way, it's a good option. You would be in a better way to growth also. But this should be cut down as far as possible. So this was the end of this off-budget borrowing. So for any other information regarding the current affairs videos, the daily current affairs, the editorial analysis, you can log on to our website www.believers IAS Academy, and you can log on to you can subscribe to our YouTube channel also. You get nice contents for the current affairs regarding UPSC examination, and you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook for any further details with respect to UPSC examination. And thus becomes our end, and thank you.